Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2553 of The Tom Woods Show, and we're joined by our old friend CJ Killmer, who hosts the Dangerous History podcast. He puts so much work into that thing, and it is work that a great many people appreciate. And in particular today, I want to talk about a chunk of his very extensive coverage of the evil Woodrow Wilson. And I thought in particular we might spend some of our time today talking about the issue of the First Amendment. And CJ, I was thinking in particular because of the comments I'm sure you saw by John Kerry. I mentioned them on the show yesterday, in which he expressed his frustration that the First Amendment was standing in the way of really being able to clamp down on so-called misinformation. So this seems like a good time to talk about the First Amendment. So welcome back.
Hey, great to be back, Tom.
All right. So you spent some time specifically on a famous case involving a socialist pamphlet or a flyer that was opposed to military conscription on constitutional grounds. So could you maybe set the stage for us, maybe even say a little bit about, because I know you talked about it, I listened to your episode, say a little bit about what was in that flyer, first of all.
Yeah, the case gets mentioned very often in like U.S. history courses and, sort of pre-law courses and things like that, but rarely do they delve into the contents of the flyer. And I think there's good reason for that, because it makes an argument that I think is pretty sound, but is also very dangerous. So the Socialist Party, I will give them credit 100% that during World War I, they were on the right side of just about every major issue related to the war. They were against American participation in the war. They were against military conscription to man the war. And they were also against all the different suppressions of civil liberties that occurred during the war. All the, newspapers getting shut down for printing the wrong thing, people getting locked up in prison. Of course, Eugene Debs was, kind of the top Socialist Party leader at the time. He ends up going to prison for giving a speech. So this particular case comes out of some Socialist Party activists in Philadelphia in 1917. And by the way, one of the first things Woodrow Wilson asked for when he got the United States into war, he asked for Congress to pass conscription, which they quickly did, and also for them to start passing laws that violate the First Amendment. And the first of these was the Espionage Act of 1917, and this was followed by the Sedition Act of 1918. And both of these acts contain some clauses, I don't have the wording right in front of me, but to the effect of it's a federal crime punishable by pretty serious monetary fines and prison sentences, to something to the effect of obstruct the recruiting or enlistment of the United States military. And this was interpreted far beyond, people would see, espionage and sedition acts, this must be about like catching German spies and saboteurs. Well, it goes far beyond that. And, what constitutes obstructing the enlistment and recruiting of the U.S. military? Well, it turns out giving a speech, potentially. It's not just like, going down to your local draft office and lighting it on fire or whatever like that. So, for example, if you were to give a speech critical of the war or of conscription or any of these things, or even just sort of questioning like the real reasons for the war happening and why the United States is in the war, you could potentially be arrested and thrown in prison, as thousands of Americans were. And the rationale was, well, look, there might be military-age young men in the audience hearing you question this war and criticize it and whatever. And hearing your dangerous words might cause such young men to dodge the draft if they're liable to be drafted. Or maybe, some young man in the audience was about to walk down and volunteer that afternoon, and your speech was so convincing that it persuaded him against it. And so therefore, in these unusual times, this has to be criminal speech. So the Socialist Party activists in this particular, what became a Supreme Court case, they were distributing a flyer, I guess you could call it a pamphlet. It's basically front and back of one page. And it makes I think, pretty strong case against conscription on constitutional grounds. it's not a flyer that's calling for socialist revolution or anything like that. It's a flyer that's calling purely for working within the existing American constitutional system and appealing to it. And what it says is pretty simple, which is the 13th Amendment, of course, as you know, passed at the end of the Civil War, which is what actually abolished slavery nationwide. It wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation. That's kind of a scam. But the 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States unless you're a convicted felon, essentially, so they can force you to do labor in a prison. But beyond that, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist. And the Socialist Party activists were arguing, and I think they're 100% right, and I've never heard a coherent, even remotely convincing argument against it. They're arguing that, hey, forcing men against their will involuntarily to go fight in a war is the very definition of involuntary servitude. Therefore, the military conscription measures during World War I are just inherently unconstitutional and therefore, should not be active, should not be allowed to stand, whatever. And again, urging them to work within the existing system, not advocating any violence, not even really advocating like nonviolent resistance even. But this was enough. This flyer was enough to get two of the leaders of this movement arrested. One of them, last name was Schenck. The other one, I believe, was Baer. The case, when it gets to the Supreme Court, gets known as Schenck v. United States. And so the Supreme Court, as you might expect, the Socialist Party activists, they defended themselves on First Amendment grounds. They said, hey, First Amendment, all we're doing is exercising our right of free speech. Therefore, us being locked up in prison for simply distributing a flyer is a gross violation of the First Amendment. And the Supreme Court, right, that last bastion of your individual civil liberties, what's supposed to be like the Batman of your constitutional rights that steps in as a last resort to save you from the oppressions of the rest of the government, well, they did what they actually do most of the time in real life, which is to simply come up with convoluted arguments as to why, the First Amendment, one of the most straightforward passages in the entire Constitution, why the First Amendment doesn't actually apply in this case to peaceful activists getting locked in prison for distributing a flyer.
Yeah, so let's get into that. What kind of arguments could they use? There were arguments defending the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 that tried to argue that the First Amendment didn't actually say what a lot of people thought it said, and it excluded certain things and this and that. But what's the Supreme Court going to tell us about this particular case?
Yeah, well, they're going to uphold the convictions and imprisonment of the Socialist Party activists. And not only are they going to uphold those convictions, but they're going to do so unanimously, too, which is really, I think, kind of disturbing and revealing. And the thing is, by the time this case worked its way to the Supreme Court, it was 1919, the war was over. And by that point, you had a lot of justices on the court who were progressive or at least progressive leaning, because ever since 1901, you had, Teddy Roosevelt, progressive president for basically 2 terms, inherited most of McKinley's second term, and then got reelected. Then you had Taft, who was a little bit better, but was still kind of progressive light. And then that was followed by 2 terms of the worst president of all so far, Woodrow Wilson. And so because of this, you had close to 2 decades of presidential dominance of the White House. And as a result, the Supreme Court was full of a lot of justices who bought into the progressive worldview. And, progressives have always really kind of despised the Constitution because they don't like anything that imposes solid, hard, and fast limits on what the state can do. And so they've always had to deal with the problem from their perspective, as you alluded to with some of these recent statements coming out of John Kerry and a few other people. They've always had to struggle with the fact that the Constitution is there. A lot of the stuff, at least in the Bill of Rights, is fairly straightforward and not that hard for ordinary people to understand. I often say, you don't go get a JD at an Ivy League university because you want to learn what the First Amendment means. Anybody with basic literacy and like a basic dictionary, if they needed to look up a few terms, can understand what the First Amendment means. You go to an Ivy League JD program so that you can learn how to, with a straight face, write multi-page legalese arguments explaining why the First Amendment doesn't actually mean what it says, and why there's all these invisible, unwritten, implied exceptions to the First Amendment that aren't there, but we, the wise, guys in the black muumuus, are going to tell you what those things mean. So what the progressives typically will do, because they know the average American might not be super familiar with the Constitution, but they have kind of a vague idea that the Constitution is generally a good thing and that the Bill of Rights is generally a good thing. And so they can't just blatantly come out and say, at least not in places where they think the general public is paying attention, they can't just come out and say, like, we think the Constitution sucks and we think the guys at the top of the government should be allowed to void it whenever we feel like it.
Although
So
in parentheses, CJ, in recent weeks, they have been coming out and saying that.
Yeah,
in
they've
the
been saying the
Atlantic and
quiet part out loud.
Yeah, right. But up till very recently, your rule held.
Yeah. They had they were in this position, and you can see it throughout Woodrow Wilson's political career, where on the one hand they have to pay lip service to the Constitution because they know if they don't, again, like you were saying, today things seem to be changing in a bad way on this. But back in Woodrow Wilson's day, they still had to make kind of a show of genuflecting at the concept of the Constitution.
Yeah.
And so instead of frontally attacking it and saying we're just going to ignore it, they would lean on the overall progressive ideology and worldview, which is that everything is dependent on specific times and places and circumstances. And so the argument kind of goes like this. Sure, in normal, mellow, peaceful times where there's no emergencies, no crises, whatever, of course the First Amendment means that you have absolute freedom of expression. Of course. But right now, meaning in this case, during World War I, right now is not ordinary times. It's an emergency. And therefore, certain things that might be okay to let you express, certain ideas that might be okay to let you express during peacetime with no emergency, suddenly become potential mortal dangers to the United States. And so this is the origin of the famous phrase. So the majority court opinion is written by the famous, and I think he's a terrible villain in most instances, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., always a tongue twister for me. The famous decision he writes in this case is the one in which he says, no amendment would protect someone from falsely yelling fire in a theater.
Yes.
Now, what I pointed out in my podcast episode on this is, to me, one of the biggest problems with that statement is that, and it doesn't get the spotlight it deserves usually when this case is treated, at least in my experience, is the key word falsely. Because what if you're yelling fire in a theater because there actually is a fire and you're the only person that has spotted it? And so in that instance, if you yell fire in a theater because there actually is a fire, you're not a troublemaker. You're not someone causing damage and danger. You're actually a hero. You're doing your civic duty to point out a problem that no one else seems to have spotted, right? And so if the socialists are correct and the government is doing unconstitutional things in the name of World War I, then they're not yelling fire falsely. They're yelling fire because there is a fire. They're spotting an unconstitutional fire and they're trying to point out to their fellow citizens, hey, look, there's a fire over there in case you don't see it. So I think even Holmes's own argument is completely like a paper tiger. It's a house of cards.
All right, folks, let's you and I talk. We both know there is no chance of getting the truth about what's going on in the world by watching CNN or any mainstream outlet. We know that. We know that even the headlines in the news are propaganda, even the headlines. But those headlines become tomorrow's history. So what is the chance that you're going to get a reliable overview of American history through a mainstream source. About as much chance as you have getting the news from CNN. So that's why old Woods here is giving you 2 free big courses in U.S. history. Absolutely free. Don't cost you nothing. And we're going through the colonial period all the way up through the end of the 20th century, and it's revisionist in the best sense, that it takes the standard narrative and it smashes it into pieces. We open up your head, we dig out anything that was put there by people who hate you, we replace it with the truth, then we close your head back up. That's what happens with my U.S. history courses, and you get them for free. Doesn't cost you a cent. So, for yourself, for younger people in your family, to take a long drive and make it worthwhile intellectually, you can listen to them anytime, anywhere. Head over to woodshistory.com and get them. woodshistory.com. But you could also say there's also the Rothbardian argument that even if you are shouting it falsely, you don't need to violate the First Amendment to handle that problem. You just say that there's no theater owner who's going to allow people to cause a commotion that could lead to harm and disrupt the performance. So the owner of the property sets a rule saying you can't do that. And that's not a violation of the First Amendment, that a private property owner can do what he wants to do. So we don't have to carve out this exception in the first place.
Right. Yeah. So, as a metaphor and an argument, it fails. And this is also the decision in which he uses the famous phrase, constitute a clear and present danger to create the very evils that Congress has a right to prevent. So, again, I don't think this gets fully emphasized enough, at least in most of the classes I took and books I read on this stuff growing up, the idea that here's this, very respected, revered Chief Justice, or not Chief Justice, but Justice of the United States Supreme Court, who's saying that expressing opinions about a constitutional question on a pamphlet is a clear and present danger to the United States government. And I just feel like that's such a huge, ominous thing that people don't really wrap their head around, I guess because they go to law school, and in law school it's treated as oh yeah, see, here's all these limits to the Bill of Rights. No big deal. But to me, that's a huge deal that a justice of the Supreme Court, representing a unanimous decision, by the way, would say that exercising your right of political expression is a clear and present danger to the United States. And he does something else that he's done in other decisions I'm familiar with, and probably others that I'm not, which is he uses conscription to validate or back up the other violations of rights going on. So in other words, he says, look, at a time where young men are being asked to fight and die for our nation, is it really too much to ask people to just, keep their mouth shut and not express certain opinions that might be disruptive to winning the war? And this is actually similar to the argument he makes in another notorious case, Buck v. Bell, about eugenics. He actually mentions conscription there too. He says something like, well, if the government can ask, and that decision came down, by the way, in between the wars when there was no conscription active, but he still leaned on conscription to validate a eugenics law, where he said, look, the government in time of war can ask young men to sacrifice their lives. And these are often the fittest and healthiest of our society who are asked to do this. And so therefore, is it really too much to ask that certain defectives and imbeciles give up their, reproductive rights or their reproductive organs in order to, have a better country and a healthier country? So it's interesting how very often people who have this sort of broadly defined progressive pro-state kind of bias, they'll often use violations of rights over here to violate other rights over there. They'll say, well, look, we already do these egregious violations of people's rights. This is not how they would put it, obviously, but, oh, look, we're already violating people's rights in this much more egregious way over here. Therefore, it's really not such a big deal to ask you to give up your rights in this other area over there.
Yeah, that's right. And it reminds me of maybe it was back in the 80s, the 90s, but when you would complain about tax rates in the U.S., you'd get so many people on the left saying, "Oh, but it's so much worse in Europe."
Mm.
And like that was the argument, that they're doing even worse things to people over there, so you should be thankful for what you have. Never quite seemed to follow.
Yeah, it's funny how governments very often want to emulate the worst aspects of other governments. And so if you pointed out, well, yeah, in all these other European countries, they might have much lower taxes in other areas, lower corporate tax rates and other things like that. They never say, well, let's emulate that.
Yeah, right. No, they don't. So let's move from this topic to the progressive era, the progressive movement more broadly. Now, the progressive era began over 100 years ago and went on for, maybe 20 years. This is kind of an arbitrary thing. But are there enough similarities between the progressives then and people who call themselves progressives now that there's anything useful that we can learn about progressives from 100 years ago in understanding things today?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I've been on this bandwagon for a while now. I've been working on the Woodrow Wilson series for years and been doing other episodes kind of related to the progressive era in Woodrow Wilson. I really believe that there's more continuity than discontinuity from the Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson era of progressivism to today. Now, it's obviously not the identical ideology. It's obviously not the same thing. It's kind of evolved over the generations. And the way I think about American progressivism is, first off, I believe it has been the default ideology of the American establishment since at least 1912, if not earlier. It largely took over almost all of American academia by the 1890s. And I think by about 1912, if not even a bit earlier, most of the American establishment, including, most of the biggest corporations and, your JP Morgans and your Rockefellers and their partners and whatever, had more or less glommed on to progressivism as a thing they were in favor of. And you can see it in the way they funded so many progressive political candidates and causes and things. The New Republic magazine was actually set up with money from a JP Morgan partner, by the way. Something I mentioned in my last big Woodrow Wilson episode when I talked about how much the House of Morgan was taking sides in World War I while the United States was nominally neutral. And it was a JP Morgan partner, George W. Perkins, who basically created the Bull Moose Party for Teddy Roosevelt and funded it. So this idea that a lot of people still hang on to and that they're taught in schools and things, that progressivism and big corporations are always like mortal enemies, is just simply not true and hasn't been true for a long time if it ever was. But the way I think about progressivism is that it has gone through versions. That's kind of how I put it. Just like versions of, software or whatever like that. So version 1.0 is your version of the Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson era, and it includes various political leaders and then also intellectuals, Herbert Crowley, people like that, Paul Johnson, Frank Johnson Goodnow, whoever he was, whatever his name was. All these leading academics of the time who kind of took over in economics and history and political science. They're largely the people that founded the professional organizations, by the way. All of these things that to this day are the leading professional organizations in, the American Economics Association, the American Historical Association, all these things, almost all of them go back to the original progressive era over 100 years ago. And as far as I'm aware, all or virtually all of them were founded by progressive academics with explicitly progressive ideological purposes in mind. Now, they would have said, well, we're just trying to, professionalize our discipline and whatever. But a lot of it was, the sort of blue-pilled conservatives who think it was just like within recent decades that academia got taken over monolithically by progressives. They're wrong. It's something that was largely accomplished over 120 years ago. So I think of progressivism version 1.0 being the Woodrow Wilson era. Progressivism version 2.0 is the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal version. It's clearly based on the Wilson version, but it's evolved in a variety of ways. Certain things are more emphasized, other things are sort of de-emphasized or left to the wayside. Version 1.0 was more explicitly racist and eugenicist than version 2.0. Version 2.0 tends to focus more on the economy and these big social programs. FDR made deals with like racist members of Congress to get things passed. And so certain aspects of the New Deal were racist in intents and in effects, but racialism wasn't as big of a component as it was in version 1.0. Version 3.0, I would say, is the kind of Great Society era version of progressivism. And again, there's changes and evolutions. There's certain things more emphasized, other things de-emphasized. The kind of overt racism largely has gone away. On the surface, there's an anti-racist element to the Good Society era progressivism. Although you could argue, that in terms of effects, it has all kinds of negative effects on a lot of the very, minority communities they were claiming to be helping. And then there's also, this kind of paternalism and bigotry of low expectations that comes along with it. And then as we get closer to the present, it's a little bit harder for me to like clearly point out, are we in the midst of progressivism version 4.0 right now or 5.0? What is it? This weird one where wokeism is a big part of it, but it still has this corporatist element. Because another thing that I see when I look at the evolution of progressivism over the last 120 years or so is the dominant version of progressivism of any era is always very pro-corporate and very, despite rhetoric that sometimes sounds like they're not. They're very pro-corporate. They're also very militaristic and imperialistic and interventionist. Now, they don't usually talk the way Teddy Roosevelt talks. He's kind of an outlier in terms of just being very gruffly, oh, I'm a tough guy, pro-war, let's, talking like John McCain or something. More common is someone like Woodrow Wilson, who sort of resembles Barack Obama in that a lot of his speeches sound very, almost pacifist, very, peaceful rhetoric and all this sort of thing. And we just want to help other countries and, help spread democracy and all these sorts of things. But then in terms of actual policies, Woodrow Wilson was a hyper-interventionist. He intervened all over Latin America in addition to getting into World War I. And so this dominant part of progressivism, pro-corporate, pro-military, pro-interventionist, also is vehemently anti-Bill of Rights. They're vehemently opposed to things like free speech. There's always been a minority streak that calls itself progressive that's better on a lot of issues than that. And so back in Woodrow Wilson's day, I would point to somebody like Robert La Follette of Wisconsin as a guy who, believed in a lot of the progressive economic programs and things, but was very staunchly opposed to American intervention in World War I. And once the U.S. was in the war, was very opposed to conscription and also opposed to all the violations of free speech and other basic Bill of Rights sorts of rights. So there's always been that kind of like minority subservient part of progressivism that from our point of view is better on a lot of important issues, but they've never been in the driver's seat of progressivism as such. And today I would point to a lot of the left-wingers that are opposed to American support for Ukraine. A lot of the left-wingers who are, very opposed to the violations of free speech under the Biden-Harris administration. Somebody like Jimmy Dore comes to mind as an example of like a media figure who I would consider part of this anti-corporate, interventionist, pro-Bill of Rights progressive tradition. But my point would be those types of progressives have never been dominant and have never been a minority. They've always been kind of a fairly fringe contingent within the larger progressive kind of milieu or movement.
Hey, everybody, this is not a sponsor message. I just wanted to remind you, first of all, that my Christmas party is coming up December 7th. It's about 35 minutes southeast of the Orlando airport, and it's a wonderful time. A chef prepares dinner for everybody in our own kitchen. I have several minor celebrities who are going to be coming, and it's just a wonderful night to get to know a lot of really great people. You can be yourself. You don't have to watch what you say. And everybody raves about it. So I hope you can attend. It's a benefit enjoyed by members of my Supporting Listeners program. Now, I have supported people on Patreon in the past, and I've been very happy to do so. But supportinglisteners.com beats the heck out of any Patreon you've ever contributed to. Because how many of those people are inviting you to a Christmas party? Or how many, instead of having you look at a godforsaken screen 24 hours a day for their content, are also mailing you in the physical mail a print newsletter like this one, 16 pages. This one's 20 pages. You get that in the physical mail, and it's not just the same things I send in my email newsletter. It's all fresh content, not seen anywhere else, just for you, nice and hot. So for a change, you can be old school. Remember, we were old school, right? We liked reading physical things. Well, ain't no podcaster or any Patreon sending you a physical newsletter, or for that matter, inviting you to a murder mystery dinner party for free. I have several of them lined up for around the country with many more to come. The one in New Orleans still has plenty of spots available, and you can pay to attend these murder mystery dinner parties, but you don't have to. You just be a supporting listener of the Tom Woods Show. You get that for free. Not to mention my censorship-free Tom Woods Show elite group. It is the best possible supporters program in the world, and you're part of a community that you just can't beat. So check it out at supportinglisteners.com, and before you know it, you will be holding in your hands one of these right here. Supportinglisteners.com, and thank you very much. Well, here's a parallel that I see with whichever version of progressivism. I think the original one and today. And that has to do with, you mentioned Herbert Crowley, the whole New Republic magazine. That has to do with their attitude about the average person. The average person is too dumb to make informed opinions. So that's why we need administrative agencies to have a broad scope for action, so that we don't have to sit around trying to convince all these stupid rubes of all the things we're trying to do that are just in their best interests. And if COVID wasn't an illustration of that, then nothing was, because they really wanted to imply that you weren't entitled to an opinion on that at all. You were to sit and wait and do as you were told. That is a part of the old progressivism that they don't emphasize because it doesn't sound particularly attractive, but it was absolutely there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing I've gotten into in some older episodes of my podcast is trying to untangle progressivism and populism, because they often get somewhat conflated. And to be fair, there was some overlap, certainly on issues, but also even some, people you might say are sort of progressive populist. It's not like a hard and fast sort of thing where there's membership cards or something. But progressives and populists in the Woodrow Wilson era, they would both be in favor of more government regulation of the economy. They might disagree on the details for sure. They would generally be in favor of certain amendments that did get passed during that period, like, the income tax, indirect election of United States senators and things like that. But there were important differences, and a big part of it really, I think, stems from what you were alluding to a moment ago, that progressivism has always been very elitist and paternalist as an ideology. It's always been top down and always has this idea of you need expert administrators who are insulated from elections. This is something that Woodrow Wilson was explicit about in a lot of his writings when he was an academic, when he wasn't running for office and wasn't concerned about expressing his own true opinions too honestly. He basically said, yeah, we're for democracy. We want elections. We want more people to vote. But we also need to have an administrative state that is insulated from elections. You can't just have, and this is why they supported civil service reform, which, did get past the kind of initial version of it in, I think it was the 1880s. And, they sold it on grounds that sound reasonable, of like, well, you don't want someone getting put in charge of running the department of such and such just because he's some political crony. You want it to be someone with some technical knowledge or whatever. But in reality, what this ends up doing is creating the permanent bureaucracy, the deep state, really, when it comes to at least the intelligence agency arms of the administrative state, where all these people are just in there for life, and doesn't matter who you elect or don't elect. You can vote against what these people want to do, 100 elections in a row, and they're still there running all the different administrative apparatuses. So populists, by contrast, genuinely believed in the idea of democracy. Now, that's got its own, flaws and shortcomings for sure, but somebody like William Jennings Bryan, for all of his faults and whatever, he genuinely did, I believe, sympathize with the common man and saw himself as trying to represent what the common man wanted as best he could. Whereas somebody who's more of a progressive, their view of democracy is more like, I'm not going to do what the common man wants, because the common man doesn't always know what's in his best interests. I know. I'm the enlightened, progressive intellectual who went to an Ivy League university and got a degree in political science or whatever it is. I know what's best for the common man better than he knows what's best for himself. And so, yeah, I'm for democracy, but democracy doesn't mean just doing what people want. And so progressives have always had a dislike of populism. And I would argue it's because populism, for all of its flaws, is essentially democracy trying to assert itself in the face of fake democracy. Because in my view, progressive democracy is essentially what I would call my little catchphrase I keep meaning to make into a t-shirt is modern democracy is just oligarchy with extra steps. And so progressives don't like populism because really populism is real democracy, or at least a real democratic impulse trying to assert itself against, these giant bureaucracies of the administrative state. And I think that's why progressives react, not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons they react so vehemently against Donald Trump, is that he's much more in the populist tradition. And they can't stand it. And you can see this elitism and paternalism in the way that they sort of react to him on like a visceral sort of cultural level. It's not just or even primarily that they disagree with his policies or whatever like that. A lot of it comes down to the way he speaks, the way he writes, the way he conducts himself. And so, this then also maps onto the way they see his supporters, the famous basket of deplorables comments or whatever like that. There's always this very strong elitism that somehow a lot of people just don't see, even though to me it's like smacking us in the face constantly that these people have this attitude.
Tell me about how extensive your series on Woodrow Wilson has been.
It has been a deep dive. It has been something that kind of grew out of control as I started doing it. I actually published the first episode of the series 5 years ago. And I've put out probably 2 to 3 episodes a year since then on average, of varying lengths. Some of them are shorter, only like a couple hours. And some of them are more hours than that. Some of them get into the length of like Dan Carlin's Hardcore History or Daryl Cooper's Murder Made, 3-4 hours. And it's going through his life and career in just painstaking detail. And the reason I decided to do this, and then it just sort of grew as I started working on it, is that I knew Woodrow Wilson was, in my opinion, we'll see what happens, current events, but up till now at least, I still think Woodrow Wilson is the worst president in American history when you look at like the long-term ramifications and ripple effects down to this day, the damage he did both to the United States and to the world. And I know that a lot of people in our sort of, circles know this. They know they often will rank him as the worst, or at least in the top, 2 or 3 worst presidents of all time. And a lot of well-read or even not that well-read libertarians will kind of know, like, oh yeah, Woodrow Wilson, Federal Reserve came in under him, the income tax, a whole bunch of other kind of big government domestic programs and things. And then also got us into World War I, and that, created all kinds of problems at home, more authoritarianism at home. And then it also completely disrupted the balance of power in Europe, had ramifications for Russia. Some of Wilson's decisions helped lead to the Russian Revolution, not that that was his intent. And then, all sorts of negative ramifications for the world, and arguably World War II is a direct result of the fact that Wilson got the U.S. into the war and then how he handled the end of the war and the aftermath of the war. But I also knew, just from my own reading, that there was a lot more detail to all of these stories that even most well-read libertarians didn't know. and that there were lots of other reasons to be against Woodrow Wilson and to despise him that they're not aware of at all. And just that in general, there's like anything else, when you delve into the details, you find all kinds of things that almost nobody's aware of. So, just to name a few examples of things I got into about Wilson during the series so far that most people I don't think are aware of, even that, know a lot about him. One is his academic writings. Those often get overlooked. And those are fascinating. They're horrible to read. I think he's a terrible writer from like a style point of view. And of course, I find most of his ideas repugnant too. But it's fascinating because we have a window into his true political beliefs in a way I can't think of another American president other than maybe a couple of the early founding fathers who wrote a lot, like James Madison or Thomas Jefferson. Other than a few of those guys, I don't know if we have any other president who comes close to where there's a huge amount of writing he did on political science type subjects for 30 years as an academic. So, and presumably what he was expressing in terms of his views on political sciencey ideas while he was a professor and president of Princeton, presumably those reflect like what he really believed in a way that his campaign speeches, once he's running for office, obviously you can't take those at face value because he's just trying to get votes and get elected. And so I kind of took one for the team a couple years ago and did a huge episode just taking apart a ton of his academic writings. And it was hard. I feel like I should have some sort of like libertarian Purple Heart for having done that. But it really helps to dig down into what progressivism really is. So that's an example. Another example that I did a standalone episode on not too long ago was I found out, and this is hardly mentioned at all in Wilson biographies and things, but I found out that Wilson, when he was governor of New Jersey for a couple of years before he ran for president, he signed into law a eugenics bill that provided for forcible sterilization of people who were deemed unfit by a state-created board of experts. Very progressive idea. And that not only did Wilson sign such a bill into law while he was governor of New Jersey, but the guy that wrote the bill for him was this weird character who later showed up in the aftermath of World War II in Buchenwald, where he had been a prisoner, but he had been a very well-treated prisoner because he was helping the Nazis in Buchenwald. He was collaborating with them. And so the guy that wrote Woodrow Wilson's New Jersey eugenics bill back in 1911 or whenever it was, later shows up during World War II collaborating with the Nazis in Buchenwald. That's a connection that I don't think, even 90% of people who are pretty well read on Woodrow Wilson have any clue about. So currently, I think I've done 12 episodes on Wilson, if I remember right, as well as several kind of Wilson-adjacent episodes like this one about the Schenck v. United States case, which, isn't really about Wilson, but it's obviously Wilson-related. And I probably have at least 3 or 4 more to go because I'm just about to, in the series, get the U.S. into war. I'm basically up to 1916. So in my next Wilson episode that I'm working on now and hope to get out next month, I'm going to cover him getting the U.S. into the war, and then also, some of the early measures and things. Oh, before that, I'm going to cover his re-election in 1916. I still have to get into that, and then get into him actually getting the country into the war, his famous speech, his arguments. I might mention some of the rebuttals in Congress from people like La Follette, who argued against getting into the war, and then some of his earliest measures. Because right away, he started passing authoritarian measures, such as the Selective Service Act, such as the Espionage Act, to crack down on civil liberties, like right from the get-go. So yeah, the Woodrow Wilson series is a many-year, you hear about a project of love. Well, this is a project of hate. My absolute hatred of Woodrow Wilson and everything he stands for and everything that he did. I really do think we're living in, ideas have consequences. And to a large extent, I believe that we're living in the consequences of Woodrow Wilson's ideas.
How would you say Wilson is typically described in a classroom textbook? I wonder if that might have evolved a little bit because of the more sensitivity to his racial opinions. But other than that, how would you describe, do you have a grasp of that?
Yeah, it's been almost overwhelmingly positive from, as far as I can tell, from very early on, like after Wilson's death. And the reason for that, to me, is pretty simple, which is since Woodrow Wilson himself was an academic, American academia has been 90% plus progressive. And so naturally, since progressive academics are sort of like, the gatekeepers, they're the ones that Newsweek goes to when they want to compile a list of the best and worst presidents or whatever. They poll a bunch of, tenured historians with PhDs at fancy universities, right? And so these guys are all predisposed to like somebody like Woodrow Wilson. Not only is he a progressive, he's a progressive academic. He's the only president we've ever had who held a PhD. And he had a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University, and he taught at Princeton and was president of Princeton University for many years. So if you're, a later generation progressive academic scholar, you're going to just be predisposed to want to like this guy. And so the view seems to have been for a long time, he was flawed. Wilson was flawed, mostly good, passed a bunch of wonderful measures that helped the country move forward into the new era, such as the enlightened idea of an income tax. We were such unfortunate barbarians for over a century of American history with no federal income tax. We didn't know how bad we had it. But Wilson fixed that. He also gave us the Federal Reserve System, which, as we all know, is and always has been doing a bang-up job of preserving the value of the dollar and encouraging employment and regulating the economy so that the boom and bust cycle hasn't existed since 1913. All of these other wonderful things, the Securities and Exchange Commission and whatever. And he also was smart enough, it took him a little while, unfortunately, but he eventually was smart enough to realize that it was inevitable and a good thing to get Team America into World War I. And, at most they'll criticize him for maybe dragging his feet a little bit too long and not getting into it right away like Teddy Roosevelt wanted to do. But they'll say it was a good thing and a progressive thing that Wilson got the U.S. into World War I. And typically, they would say it was all great except he failed to get the Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and therefore failed to get the United States to join the League of Nations. And he did that just because of some personal shortcomings. He wasn't willing to wheel and deal with Henry Cabot Lodge enough or whatever to compromise on the treaty to get them to ratify it. And so the treaty was wonderful. The League was wonderful. His own personal shortcomings prevented him from getting it ratified by the Senate, though. And unfortunately, the establishment academics would say, because of that, the U.S. didn't join the League of Nations. And if only the U.S. had joined the League of Nations, World War II might not have happened and everything would have been better. And so it's simply that he kind of failed to achieve his last great achievement, the League of Nations, with the U.S. in it. Obviously, in more recent decades, there's been more sensitivity to the fact that Wilson was very much a racist. And I think that progressivism version 1.0 is inextricably tied to racism. And I did do an entire standalone episode a year or two ago just about Woodrow Wilson and race, where I dug into that in huge detail, because the short answer is he absolutely was a racist, by not by the woke definition of racist, whereby almost everybody's racist, who's white at least, but even by the kind of reasonable traditional understanding of what racism means. Wilson was a racist. But it's complicated. He's an Ivy League educated, genteel racist. He's not like a working class Ku Klux Klansman type racist. It's very different. It's, equally a doctrine I wouldn't subscribe to, but it's not the same thing. So in more recent years, that's been a bigger deal. And so now, as far as I can tell, the academic establishment view on Wilson is most of his domestic reforms were great ideas. Getting the U.S. into World War I was a great idea. They will occasionally say, yeah, the Wilson administration went a little bit too far in suppressing civil liberties in some ways during the war. They'll kind of give that a little bit. And then he was a racist. But basically, if you ignored the racism, he was a great or near great president, is basically the consensus from what I can tell.
Isn't it interesting which people you can ignore the racism of, and which ones you can't? by an interesting coincidence, it happens to be all the ones the progressives like. You can ignore that part. But the rest, it's the defining characteristic.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, do you say and do the right things on other issues? It's sort of like how, progressives who talk a good game about supporting feminism or whatever can then get exposed as being, sexual predators, right? I mean, just think about how many, to this day, how many self-proclaimed feminists still see Bill Clinton in a good light, after everything that's come out, or, any of a number of other leading progressive figures who have had, sexual crimes against women exposed about them. And yet they still often, there's sort of a limit beyond which they kind of get thrown under the bus. But up to a certain point, they can still stay in the good graces of feminists as long as they say the right things about, abortion and the patriarchy and whatever. There's always the loopholes if you espouse the right ideology.
Where do people go if they would like some more dangerous history, as you say?
Well, you can look for the Dangerous History Podcast wherever you like to consume your audio podcasts. My website you can go to at dangeroushistorypodcast.com. I've also started doing more on YouTube recently as well. So I would urge people to go subscribe to the Dangerous History Podcast YouTube channel too, because I plan on doing more. I've actually been upgrading some of my video production equipment and things like this, seeking to branch out more into video production. And also, you can support me on Patreon and get access to several hundred episodes that are no longer available to the general public. Going back for a decade now, I've been doing this podcast. And that's at patreon.com/PROFCJ. And if I could, I've got one other big thing that I just launched today that I would love to share with your listeners. And that is, I'm going to be teaching a course coming up in about 3 weeks. I'm calling it the Dangerous History Live Seum. Ha ha ha, I'm so clever. Live Seum. I'm going to be teaching a 4-part course on the decline and fall of the Soviet Empire, which is going to be every Tuesday starting October 22nd and leading up through, I believe it's November 12th, something like that. And I'm selling access to the course on Patreon. Patreon now allows you, in addition to selling like monthly memberships and things, also to sell a la carte products. And so if your listeners go to patreon.com/PROFCJ/shop, they'll see I've got a couple things there, but one of them is this course, The Decline and Fall of the Soviet Empire. And they can sign up there. Again, it's starting October 22nd, every Tuesday for 4 weeks. Going to be delving through the decline and fall of the Soviet Empire. And for Tom Woods listeners, I've got a 10% discount code. Just put in the code WOODS. Very easy to remember. And you get 10% off my Dangerous History Live Seum course.
All right, I'll make sure and put these links at tomwoods.com/2553 also in the video description. It's good to have this background, to know the kinds of rationalizations that have been given for completely indefensible things that have happened in U.S. history. As you say, if you were to take a class on this stuff, you'd get a line or two about it, but you wouldn't actually read what was in that flyer. Like when I talk about the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions of 1798, and they say, "Oh, but the New England states were against it." Okay, but I've actually read what the New England states said against it, and it's really dumb and evil, So It's good that you're out there doing this work for us, and we appreciate it very much. So thank you very much for your time today, CJ.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.